Hello and welcome to this very special book discussion on the narrow corridor, state societies and the fate of liberty, authored by Professor James Robinson and Daron Acemoglu. Before I get into introductions, I'd just like to walk you through what the rest of the hour will look like. We'll open up with introductions, of course, and then the professor will walk us through his ideas around the book. That's going to take about 10 minutes. We'll turn to our panelists then for their observations, and then we'll move into a more free-flowing format and we'll try and get as many questions in as possible. Our apologies for the delay and thank you very much to our audience for being patient through this. Technology, as we know, has taken us for a ride through 2020, but also been of some help. So let me move straight to the introductions now. First and foremost, it's very nice to welcome Professor James Robinson. Congratulations on your book. Thank you for joining us and discussing this. The third book for you in collaboration with your co-author, and this is a follow-up, of course, to the professor's 2012 international bestseller, Why Nations Fail. Also joining in, Mihir Swaroop Sharma, who's Senior Fellow at ORF, the Observer Research Foundation, and heads our Economy and Growth Program. You've seen his words, of course, across many publications, including Business Standard and Bloomberg, and Roshan Kishore, who's Data and Political Economy Editor at the Hindustan Times. So, gentlemen, welcome to all three of you. Professor, I thought I might lead the stage up for you by opening up to our audience with a quote from the book that might set some context for everything you're going to walk us through over the next 10 minutes. Human progress depends on the expansion of the state's capacity to meet new challenges and combat all dominances, old and new, but that won't happen unless society demands it and mobilizes to defend everybody's rights. I think that's sort of a little bit of the pulse of your book, but let me hand the stage over to you to walk us through what it was that went into creating this.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let me show everybody some slides just very quickly, which I can't see. Can you see them?
Yep.
Okay. I can't see them, which is a problem. Okay, great.
Slide now, which is the introduction. If you'd like to move to slide number 2.
Yeah, I can't see them anywhere. Yeah. Okay.
Just if you can press the next button or the right arrow, I'm sure it'll take you there.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I can open it on my screen. Okay. All right. Thanks. Okay. So what's this book about? There's different ways of talking about that, but here's a sort of very simple way that the book makes two claims, if you like. I think the first one of which, we could argue about, and the second one, which if you agree to the first one, the second one is much easier to think about. And here's the first claim, which I motivate quoting John Locke's second treatise of government, which is that humans want to live in liberty. Okay, so what did Locke mean by liberty? Well, he meant, a state of liberty was a situation where people have perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. So this is what a philosopher would call negative liberty. People want to be free without interference and to be able to make decisions and organize their lives and relate to people as they wish. That's the first claim. The second claim, and that's a universal thing. And the second claim is, if that's your definition of liberty, there's an enormous variation in the extent to which people enjoy that in the world. And in some sense, you could think of the book as trying to provide a theory or an explanation as to why there is such variation. Okay, so just to motivate what that theory might look like in 10 minutes, let me just start by thinking about the variation. Okay, so what's I don't know what slide you can see now. What slide can you see?
Thinking about the variation.
Okay, great. So what's the, if you're thinking about liberty or the opposite of liberty, illiberty, where would you start thinking about in the world today? Well, I would start thinking about China, so here's Tiananmen Square. If you've been in China recently, you know that the Chinese government are putting millions and millions, tens of millions of these face recognition cameras up everywhere. So when George Orwell wrote that Big Brother was watching you, it actually wasn't technologically possible for Big Brother to watch you, but now it is, and there's one of the Big Brothers on the wall, behind the cameras. So this is, to me, this is clearly a situation where there isn't liberty, and it's also a situation where it's sort of clear what's driving that, meaning there's a very powerful state which is dominating society. Okay, that's something that Locke would have understood very well. But it's obviously not the whole story in the world. There's lots of places that don't look at all like China, but they don't have much liberty either. Here's an example, from Yemen in the Arabian Peninsula. So here, this is young men, and you can see that every young man has a dagger in their belt. So when you become of age in Yemen, you get a dagger, and this is a very militarized and conflict-ridden society, and I'm not talking about the present tragic civil war, but even before the civil war, this was a very different situation from what you have in China. In fact, it's not a situation where the state dominates society like in China. If anything, it's the opposite. Here's Max Weber, one of the founders of sociology. He proposed a famous definition that the state is the human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. But in Yemen and many other places like it, it's not the state that has the monopoly of violence. It's actually society that has the legitimate monopoly of violence. It's sort of the opposite of the situation that Weber talked about. But of course, that doesn't create liberty either, and for familiar sources, and at least two sources. One is the kind of obvious one, which is you read any history or ethnography of Yemen, that there was a lot of conflict and violence and feuding, and that's something that Hobbes wrote about in his famous book Leviathan, and that's a source of illiberty, a kind of he called that war with two R's, but that's not the only problem in a place like Yemen, because actually things don't look exactly like Hobbes would have thought about them, because society creates all sorts of norms and practices which reduce the potential for conflict and kind of create some sort of order, but which also inhibit liberty to a large extent. Okay, so on the one hand, the state dominates society. That doesn't create liberty. On the other hand, society dominates the state. That doesn't create liberty. So where does liberty come from? And the argument in the book is that in between, there's a balance, and here's the diagram that's meant to sort of sum it all up. In between, there's a kind of balance. There's a balance between state and society. And that's the circumstances under which liberty emerges. And a lot of the book is trying to sort of use this very simple diagram to help sort of think through history, in some sense, the historical creation of states and society, and try to understand the circumstances under which this balance emerges, and it can be sustained. And when the circumstances in which, a society kind of topples off into this Chinese direction, where the power of the state comes to dominate the power of society, or whether it topples off in the other direction. And I don't know if you can see this diagram. Can you see the diagram?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Whether or not, that you topple off in the other way, such that the power of society comes to dominate the state. So the whole book is about this balance between state and society, and how liberty emerges when one dominates the other. And if you'll indulge me, I could just tell you some of the stories we have in the book, so about the deep historical roots of this. So this is not a theory about, about geography or about, it's really a story about historical contingency. And this diagram is meant to kind of suggest that, the fact that, say, Western Europe ended up with more liberty than China or Yemen is, that's not something, about Europeans or about Chinese people. It's just about a particular balance that got established between state and society historically, and the types of dynamics that created. I could just tell you, about the Chinese case, for example. I'm not going to talk about King Clovis because I don't have time. But what's interesting about the Chinese case, is that if you go back in Chinese history, before the rise of the first dynasty, then there's all sorts of elements of balance between state and society. Here's a famous Confucian text, the Hunzi, with an oft-quoted passage: "The king is a boat, the common people are the water holds up the boat, or the water sinks the boat." So the king rests on the people, and if the people don't like the king or what the king is doing, they sink the boat. So this is a model of kind of accountability, or it's a model of the state has to act in the interests of the people. But that's a model that was sort of obliterated, by the intellectual ferment of the Warring States period. And here's one of the kind of intellectual mentors of the first dynasty. He was dead before that happened. And he said, Shang Yang, when the people are weak, the state is strong. When the people are weak, the state is strong. When the people are strong, the state is weak. Hence, the state that possesses the way strives to weaken the people. So he had exactly this idea that you have to weaken the people to make the state strong. And if the people are strong, the state is weak. That's sort of like he's talking about two of our outcomes. And that's the philosophy. That's the philosophy in China which has reigned. And here's its most recent manifestation of the social credit system. So this is a very deeply seated kind of equilibrium in China. It goes back a long way, and the diagram is meant to sort of help you think about this. Historically, there were these small differences between these different societies in the balance of power between the state and society, and they had these very fundamental long-run consequences. The same with Yemen. We know a lot about Yemen, about the history of Yemen. There's Arabic, there's writing. We right back to the time of the Prophet. And so we know also a lot about the history of that very persistent nature of that kind of outcome in Yemen. And so I should probably shut up now. You got the idea. That's the book. Yes. Should I shut up? Is that a good moment to shut up?
No, that's wonderful, actually.
Okay.
And if there's anything else you'd like to touch upon, please feel free, because it's a fascinating walkthrough. So if there was anything else that you'd like to touch upon, we can totally make time for that.
Okay. Now what happens?
Now I ask you a question.
Okay.
Then we open up to the panelists. So I thought I might, sort of broad base this to get the discussion going. If we work with the idea of that successful social equilibrium that you've alluded to in your book, I think the question that arises is, why is it so difficult to achieve? What is that magic chemistry between economy or geography or culture that makes it happen and equally makes it difficult to achieve?
Yeah, I don't think it's to do with geography or economy, actually. I mean, I think it's to do with, features of the ability of society to organize collectively. I think we emphasize a lot that there's this balance between state and society, that when states get stronger, they build fiscal systems, or they build regulatory institutions, they try to control society, then that's sort of in the DNA of the state in some sense. And so society has to control that, but that's got, how does it control it? Well, it organizes, like the civil rights movement, or through political parties, or the Chartists in 19th century Britain, or the Congress Party in India, or, society has to create organizations, and it has to act, it has to identify what the problem is, and it has to be able to act, towards those collective goals. And I think that rests a lot on idiosyncratic aspects of the society. Maybe it does depend on the economy, maybe it depends on class formation, and whether there's social classes or how urbanized things are. Or in the book, we emphasize a lot, kind of social structures, like one thing that makes it difficult in Yemen, for instance, to kind of organize collectively is that the society is divided into these sort of descent groups or lineage groups, and so there's sort of social structures that are very different and make it very hard, for that. It's a social structures that allow you to kind of coordinate or cooperate for some things, but in other ways make it very difficult to cooperate. So I think a lot of the book is about that. I mean, in the end, when we talk about India, I mean, I hesitate to talk about India, since I'm not an expert or a scholar of India by any stretch of the imagination. But I think in the India case, it's very easy to start thinking about these sort of social structures like the caste system, which makes it hard to kind of, society is sort of, it's hard to collaborate socially because there are all these kind of distinctions, so that's, that's the type of, so I would think of that as very, I don't think we have a structural theory of that. We tend to think of that as being pretty, you could think of that's related to, oh yeah, but you're talking about individualism, maybe that's the Reformation, and it's Calvin and it's something to do with, so, but again, that's you could say that's a pretty idiosyncratic process. That's to do with the politics of, of the Holy Roman Empire, or, so I think at the level we talk about that in the book, that seems to be fairly idiosyncratic, this ability of societies to organize collectively, and I don't think we really have an explanation for why that varies so much, but I think that's where the interesting action is.
Excellent. Let me swivel to our panelists and get their thoughts in as well. Mihir, why don't you jump in first?
Right. So, well, thank you for that, Mithali, and thank you, Professor Robinson. I just want to sort of begin by maybe just, actually, in fact, complimenting you, because I think that in some sense, this is an extraordinary distance that you guys, you and Daron have traveled from the old, from the over the course of 20 years, from the original AJR papers of 20 years ago, which thought about how institutions could be formed and looked at a particular example of an instrument that you could, use for figuring out what institutions are, which was how colonization happened. And here you've got this sort of plethora of examples that sort of go into trying to describe how you create this narrow corridor where state and society are held in balance. So, I mean, if I was to sort of talk about this, I would sort of maybe organize my thoughts around two broad points, and one is maybe sort of Thatcherite, and one is sort of Marxist, in order to, irritate the broadest sort of section of people possible. So I think that on the sort of Thatcherite side, I'd start by saying that there's no such thing as society, right? And by which I mean that in some cases, while reading this book, I felt like the word society was too broad to talk about what you meant, which was, I think we have an understanding of what the state is. But in some sense, if you define society purely as human connections and organizations of all sorts outside the boundaries of the state, maybe we're being a little overbroad. Not to mention, some of those connections and organizations can be implicated by the state in one way or the other, and I'll come to that in a bit. So I think we're left with the idea that in order to reach this narrow corridor of development, and now if I sort of put a policy hat on, what we need is a different society. And actually, I kind of agree with this, to the extent that I do believe that social change is perhaps in many parts of the world the most important prerequisite for the creation of a particular kind of properly regulated state. But I'm also struggling to see sometimes how it's implementable unless we have a clearer idea of what and how. And so I'll get back to this, but a quick point in this context about India, which I think may illuminate some of what I'm saying, which is that the book, to my mind, correctly identifies caste as the, maybe the broad rubric with which you should best talk about the divisions that determine the nature of Indian society. And I think that that's a sensible way to think about it. What I think is interesting that is, and this is a lot more, maybe Roshan can say more about this, is that if you look at India's recent politics, one way of looking at it, maybe not necessarily what I agree with, but one way that a lot of people would, a statement a lot of people would make that, and many would agree with, is that the salience of caste organization, and I'm not saying the salience of caste in daily life, but caste as an organization and as a cage may have declined. And at least we do see the growth of a narrative that Hindu society has moved beyond caste, which, again, true or not, has helped consolidate it into a more unitary voting bloc. And oddly, I think this has led to strengthening the despotism of the state and not the reverse. So the question here is, has Indian society strengthened or weakened vis-a-vis the state as caste becomes less central to political organization? And it's not a clear answer to me. And I think what has happened perhaps is that a more majoritarian society has grown strong enough to capture the state. And it's very difficult right now for me to claim there is any distinction between state and society in India. And what happens when that happens? And now you say that, I like your discussion of elite control in many parts of the book, but I think that's the wrong lens for a lot of us in 2020, and I needed more about populist majoritarianism. Now, you do talk about Middle Ages Italian communes, you talk about Latin America more recently, but I think that, again, populism isn't necessarily some sort of false consciousness led by devious elites. It can be, but it's not necessarily that. And I don't think that's what we have in India, for example. And I think that you say, and another place where you say that populism works, if, for example, it cooperates with the institutions of the corridor that you identified, which is liberal democracy. But how do I tell cooperation from co-option? How can I write out those markers that tell me when populism is cooperating and when populism is co-opting? And that's not easy for me to tell. And if I can't write out those markers, I cannot write a column that convinces people that what is happening is co-option of an institution and not cooperation with the institution. And that's the problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's and finally the Marxist point, which is, what about technology? Now, I mean, the Marxist sort of idea that technology determines productive relations and that's the political superstructure. And I think you do a great job talking about technological change and its implications, for example, on the dynamism of democratic societies and stuff like that. But I think we also need to understand, at least, I mean, from the point of view of, again, policy, how does technological change the shape of this narrow corridor? So how does it advantage states? And you reference, the Hariri on this in the intro, but I think I'd have liked your own take of it in the context of your model. And how does it advantage societies? I mean, the old claim at least 10 years ago was social media would advantage society in its battle against the states, right? That was the whole Orange Revolution claim. Maybe that's not true, but that was a claim. How does it disadvantage society? I would say that technological change changes productive relations, causes fewer trade unions to form, less social democratic society, right? So that's another way in which it changes the shape of the corridor. So I think, and I felt that you brought a somewhat insufficient explanation about, that globalization, inequality, discontent, populism explanation, which I won't say I'm bored with, but I know you can't possibly believe is the only story, right? There's something deeper there about state and society that I think you guys could reach for, and I felt you stopped short of it, and I won't sort of push you on that. And these are just my sort of remarks on that. So that only Mitali, less remarks, more questions. So.
Thank you for that, Mihir. Professor, would you like to respond first to Mihir's points and then we move to Roshan, or would you like to collate everything you've heard and then respond to it?
I'm happy to conform to whatever your norms are. Yeah.
Okay. So then let me quickly get Roshan's thoughts in as well, so that we can, put this all into one block. Roshan, all yours.
Thank you, Mitali, and thank you, ORF, for giving me an opportunity to share my views with Professor Robinson. I think he and Daron are among the foremost social scientists we have today. Am I audible, right? Clearly? All right. So, I'll quickly, I think the sheer ground which the book covers, it is, I think it is decades of accumulated knowledge and wisdom. So it is impossible for anybody to sort of comment, on the entire book. But what I'll do is I'll, share my views on the general principles which the book underlines, and then come to India, where I think I'll have more to say. First of all, why is the book important? Professor Robinson said that, he's not giving a theory, but I think this is, a social scientist's attempt, at giving a theory of basically everything. I mean, here is a book which is explaining, from the Roman Empire to, the rise of Islam to what is happening in Donald Trump's time. So, and the beauty of the project, I think, is that the authors are, the theory is extremely comprehensive without being deterministic. It is in a way a beautiful amalgamation of what can be described as a dynamic framework, which is more dialectical in the Marxist sense than dynamic, because it is not dynamic as one would study differential equations. Now, here is a society which can actually keep going in and out of that narrow corridor. So if one were to paraphrase the Communist Manifesto, according to Robinson and Acemoglu, the history of all civilizations is their movement in that two-dimensional graph which Professor Robinson just showed us. So that, I think, is the beauty of the book. And while there can be grounds to agree or disagree or add to their individual case studies, and there are a lot of them, I think the general discussion is very empowering. What is the process, I think, which has led to, and why such a work has not been produced? I think what they have done is, this is a fusion of knowledge which exists today in economics, in history, and political theory. I don't think anybody has ever attempted this kind of a work, and which is why it adds to all of us, people like us who practice social sciences, who deal with these ideas on a daily basis. I think it is very important that we engage. I was trained in economics in the heterodox tradition, and there is a complaint today that economics has strayed away from the ideas of classical political economy. But even classical political economy or the larger ideas of income distribution, even Marxian ideas, although they're very attractive because of the equality they promise, I don't think they've been able to tell us what exactly went wrong with, say, something like a Soviet Union, or what exactly whether or not something will go wrong with a society like China. Because I mean, the Marxists understood the economics, but they could never tell us about politics and society. That is where I think it is a very important work which these two have done. Now let us come about India, and I know I have I made some notes. The book identifies caste as the central front line in India, and I'm quoting here. They say, when democracy arrived after independence, caste defined the battle lines and political competition and stopped the energy of democratic competition, which meant that the Red Queen remained broken and caste divisions made it impossible for the society to get organized. Well, I would like to raise 3 points vis-a-vis this argument. I think, and I would pick up from what Mihir was saying. Caste is probably the oldest and the most difficult to overcome fault line in our society, and it goes back thousands of years. But it is by no means the only fault line which exists today. I think one area which the book should have looked at is India actually underwent partition on religious lines when we got independence. So first it was India and Pakistan, and then Pakistan also subsequently got partitioned into Bangladesh. And the tensions which led to the partition, I think, is what the authors actually describe to as the Red Queen effect being the zero-sum game. Hindus and the Muslims, even when our freedom struggle was going on, could never actually come to terms, or allay each other fears about what power sharing would be once the country got its independence and we were in a democratic framework. And like Mihir said, those fault lines have never receded. So today, the BJP's political dominance actually is to build a rainbow coalition of Hindu castes. And what Mihir said again, a lot of political conflict around caste, which you see in India today, is actually intra-Varna. And Professor Robinson he refers to the Varna system on India. So you see OBCs fighting with OBCs, you see Dalits fighting with Dalits. So it is not necessarily, it doesn't subscribe to the hierarchy which we understand caste when we say the Varna system. And for example, I think their book refers to Jeff Witzow's book on democracy against development in Bihar. So it is this ability to build a rainbow caste coalition which allowed the BJP to sort of defeat parties like Lalu Prasad Yadav's Rashtriya Janata Dal, which is how the BJP has defeated. And I'm not saying that the BJP is the only party which has been playing these cynical games. The Congress, India's largest party, It actually got its largest parliamentary majority in our country in 1984 when our sitting prime minister was assassinated by a Sikh bodyguards, who are another religious minority in the country, and there were massive anti-Sikh riots before the elections. So what I'm saying is, and to come back to Mihir's point, you have a situation in our country today where actually by transcending caste as a fault line, the ruling regime is being able to act in a despotic manner. And even though civil liberties are being curtailed, the majority, and when I say majority, I think which is what Professor Robinson and his co-author mean the societies, it actually feels very empowered, even though it has not had any material gains. And the reason for that is that, this almost a feeling of chandrafuge, that the minorities are being persecuted and this is what is empowering us. So this is one fault line, I think, which is there. Then, even religion is not the only fault line which India has. India, when it was created, so India has a long history which goes back. There's a history, in different regions of the country. But India as a union of states never existed before the British came, and when we got our independence. Language was another very important, fault line. So, when the constitutional contract was being created, and I think it would be very useful to employ the concept of the narrow corridor, which the authors talk about in their book, as the Indian constitutional contract, because it took a lot of time, it took a lot of agreements, disagreements, persuasions, and all kinds of things to eventually arrive at the constitutional contract which we had. And the biggest leap of faith was to have a universal franchise system, because here was a country which was poor, education was very poor, and still we had it. So Tamil Nadu, which the book refers to, it has had a history of anti-Hindi riots, both before independence and after independence. And Tamil people, they actually, indulge in street rioting on the question of their linguistic identity being compromised. Assam, which is a major northeastern state in the country, is going to polls next month, still has tensions on the question of language, where the Assamese-speaking population, both Hindus and Muslims, actually, are scared that the Bengali-speaking population will overcome their cultural identity. The other thing, which I think, the book refers to it in many parts, but it doesn't ask these questions about India. I think chapter 11, the book raises a question: why do paper Leviathans do not accumulate a lot of power? And I think, this is, in discussion with some Latin American country. If we look at the political economy history of this country, for example, India did not do a radical land redistribution when it got independence. Now we know that countries which did that, they actually experienced a lot of tailwinds when it came to domestic demand, when it came to industrialization. Why did we not do it? I think the biggest reason was that the Congress party, although its biggest leader was somebody like a Jawaharlal Nehru, who was very progressive in his views, but he knew that if the Congress had to win elections, they actually had to bank on the support of these local rural elite who were aligned with the Congress, but nevertheless had significant land monopoly. And you could not deprive them of their assets and then hope to bank on their political support. So that was one major thing, which actually turned out in India. Similarly, even the caste hierarchy, although I mean, it is normally believed that there was a strict economic hierarchy which conformed to the social hierarchy also. There exists work, historians like Nicholas Dirks, for example, have done a lot of work which shows that actually the way the British codified the caste system, the caste also is a dynamic phenomenon in India. In a lot of Indian states, such as Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, which are actually economically underdeveloped, the OBCs, which would be in the middle of the caste system in India, have come to enjoy significant economic power, political clout, because numerically these people were majorities. So as long as we were not independent, voting was not universal. But once the country got independence and there was universal franchise, these people actually came to capture power, because they were a numerical majority. And while discussing Sweden, the book talks about the SAP's unique ability to form a multi-class coalition. I think in India also we have done this very beautifully. To go back to the constitutional consensus, one of the things, and I think we aced the challenge of having a multi-caste coalition was, and maybe it was inadvertent. I don't think it was even planned. B.R. Ambedkar, who was the biggest emancipator of Dalits in our country. I mean, had it not been for him, we would be socially a very retrograde society. He is the de facto father of constitution in our country. And, the result of which is that, the scheduled caste, the Dalit population in this country, who are the economically most disadvantaged, their educational standards are still very poor. They are entitled to a lot of historical grievance because of the oppression they have faced. They see the constitutional contract as something which is B.R. Ambedkar's legacy. So for anybody, elite, non-elite, progressive, radical, conservative, for anybody to undermine that contract is basically, it is basically inviting the wrath of the Dalits in our country. They see the constitution as sacred, and in a way, it is a very good thing for India. And the last thing which I would like to say is, I mean, all of this doesn't mean that the constitutional contract is not under strains in India. It has always been, it will always be the case. And this is something the authors always say, that there's no static in that narrow corridor. But I think what we are witnessing now is more than the social contract, the economic contract is unraveling at a very fast pace. India started with a state-led industrialization kind of a model. It did not deliver results. Eventually, we had to sort of open up, liberalize our economy, etc. But the negotiations or the bargaining around liberalization in India, I think, has also been a negotiation between big capital, big business, and the state. The big business wants to increase its own profits, etc. But I think the state also, it has to keep big business happy because political funding matters, but it also needs to keep the voters happy. So what we have seen, when India embarked on a state-led industrialization strategy, big business actually wanted the state to do that because they didn't have the resources to pursue a heavy infrastructure kind of an economic development. Today, big business wants the state to deregulate. It actually even wants to compete with foreign capital, which at one point of time, big business was not capable of. So something like the agitation around the agricultural reforms this government has initiated, I think, is a perfect example of that. So this also is becoming more and more interesting as to what will happen in this multi-caste coalition, which the Indian state has somehow managed to work on. None of the observations, like I said, undermine the central argument of your book. I think it is very fascinating, and for a horde of social scientists, young journalists, etc. I mean, we would be inspired to ask the right questions from your book. And there's only one question, Professor Robinson, which I want to pose to you. Your book talks a lot about this process where societies are not stable, etc. I think one question which you could talk a little about. It is one thing to see this process as a historical process, as society is moving in and out of the corridor. But in a democratic setup, it is ultimately individuals who also play a very large role in determining the course of history. If you are in a democratic system, then even to get a 5 percentage point swing in your vote share, say, whether it is Trump in the United States or whether it is the ruling party here in India, the BJP, or any other party, for example, I think the incentives are very high to take calculated risks, which could actually throw your society out of the narrow corridor. And you can't, a politician won't be judged by the fact that you actually did not take that risk and your party lost in the election because you wanted your society to stay in the narrow corridor. I know I'm getting into some sort of an individual incentive kind of a game, which is more game theory than the larger stylized fact picture which were presented as. But I would really like to know what you think about it. How does this theory align with the theory or lack of it of individual incentives in politics? Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Roshan. That's a lot for you to have collated, Professor. I know a lot of people in India as well, even though you mentioned that that's you're not an expert in it, but we feel very deeply about that. So let me hand over to you first for your responses, and then we'll meander through this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for those kind words and all those really very interesting, challenging questions. I mean, I think if I start with in the sort of chronological order, Mrs. Thatcher, there's no such thing as society. I was actually I was a student at the London School of Economics when she said that, so I remember it very vividly. And in fact, Mrs. Thatcher is probably responsible for me becoming an economist, because I went to the LSE to study political science, but political science was all about economics. If you went to a political meeting, they were all talking about the money supply and privatization, and I didn't know what the money supply was, so I thought I'd better find out. And then I got obsessed with it, so I became an economist. I think this sort of obsession with society has really just come from my own field work. That I've been working for 25 years in South America, in Africa, and you can't do research in Bolivia, rural Bolivia, and without suddenly realizing that the type of society you grew up in England, it's completely irrelevant. There's all these social structures, there's reciprocity, there's norms, there's the way resources are allocated, the way it's completely different. And then I've been working for all this time in Africa, and it's the same thing. What strikes you, as somebody like me, as a Westerner, brought up and educated in England, is that things really different here. You know, I've never done serious research in India, but one would imagine one would have the same. So I think most economists manage to somehow ignore things like that, you know, because they look at prices or something, or markets or something like that, you know. But I've always been kind of overwhelmed at these social differences and how important they are in different parts of the world. So I think we've been trying to bring that much more into what we do and how we think about variation in the world. And I, you know, and that, you know, I don't think that's not a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. You know, I think that's, you know, one of the reasons I think being in Africa so much is because the society is so different. You know, it's so kind of welcoming to outsiders, and it's just so kind of dense socially, and it's very different from this sort of alienating Western society of kind of, you know, individualists. And I actually think that's a good thing. So I think that's why, you know, I think that's the book. That's obviously a big part of the book, and that's not something we've really worked on before. And, you know, we've been trying to do research on it. And I think we're struggling, and a lot of your questions are kind of really apposite here. You know, we're struggling to find the right, and this came up, you know, in Mitali's question too. We're sort of struggling to find the right generalizations. You know, like if I look at social structures in rural Bolivia and I compare that to, you know, Nigeria or something, or India, you know, they're very deeply, they're very different. They're very different culturally. They're very different historically. You know, they focus on different things. And what's, you know, you know, we've been struggling, I suppose, to find the right sort of generalization and the right abstractions to think about that. And I think that's, you know, and so it's too complicated for us. So I think like a lot of the questions you're asking, they're very good questions, but the answer's not going to be very good, you know. And I think this question of change also, you know, social change, I think, you know, I know that there's a very intense kind of debate in India about, yeah, the caste system is, you know, the Varnas are mentioned, you know, in these very historical, you know, Vedas or whatever. So at some level, obviously they go back, they're very ancient in Indian society, but obviously they're also very affected by colonialism, you know, in the same way that identities in Africa were heavily impacted by colonialism. Like these notions of ethnicity, you know, were, yes, of course they existed, you know, before colonialism, but they were clearly impacted by colonialism too, that affected people's incentives to identify in different ways. And, you know, then colonials came with all sorts of stereotypes, you know, about these societies, and they tried to kind of fit things into their stereotypes. And but it's interesting that, you know, you say, but these things change, you know, so maybe caste is changing. I don't know enough about India to know whether things are changing today. And it's, you know, but how do you conceptualize the impact of that change, you know, interacting with, what's the impact of that interacting with the state? And that, you know, so you know, your claim was sort of, well, actually many of these distinctions sort of disappear, and, you know, society becomes, you know, more majoritarian, I think was the word you used, and then it sort of overwhelms the state in some sense. And I think, you know, relative to our previous work, you know, like in Why Nations Fail, for example, you know, Why Nations Fail, we had no way of talking about this. You know, we had very much this sort of elite-centric way of thinking about, you know, when do extractive institutions emerge? Extractive institutions emerge because they're very good for elites, you know, who use them to create monopolies and barriers to entry and kind of dominate society, you know. So you know, that's a great model of Guatemala, you know, but it may not be a great model of the rest of the world. And I think part of our kind of intellectual journey is sort of saying, well, that's really not the story in Yemen, you know, or the Central African Republic, where the president, you know, doesn't control anything, you know, 5 miles outside Bangui, you know, like there's, you know, what people, you know, so I think we've tried to kind of bring these other things more into the book, but I think there's a lot of loose ends because there's many things we don't understand, you know, and this idea of like, you know, under what circumstances does society overwhelm the state? And I guess my answer to that is, well, you know, that's where the balance comes in, that if one of the one of the two gets ahead of the other, and maybe that's what you're describing, that, India, the Indian state is kind of very strong in some dimensions. And I've always been incredibly impressed by this ability to organize elections in India. That's just a wonderful thing to see. That's a mega piece of state capacity, but obviously it's terrible at doing other things. And so I guess what we say later on in the book, where we try to tackle exactly this issue that you're raising about, what's cooperation and what's co-opting, and how would I distinguish the two? I mean, I think it's what we say is it's when one thing runs ahead of the other, So India, is in this situation where you could sort of say the state is weak and society is weak. That's not too bad. It's much better than China or Yemen. Because it's very hard to go from Yemen or China into the corridor. Because there's just so much working against it. But India is not like that. And maybe you're saying it's even less like that than it used to be. If it was ever like that, because caste distinctions are and as you're pointing out, the constitution, we quote heavily from Ambedkar's work, because it's very inspiring read, Ambedkar's writings, and there's also a kind of intellectual project to kind of change Indian society. It's interesting, your discussion of the constitution. Sorry, I'm jumping around. I'm talking about Roshan a little bit here because it seemed relevant. There's also been a real sort of program of social change, or attempts to change the way society is, and that's an unusual thing. I think, that's not something that you see in many of these places. That's not something you see in Yemen, or whatever, where there's some kind of collective recognition that this is a problem and we'd like to change it, and here's some instruments. Maybe they work imperfectly, but the progress is perhaps there is progress happening, But I guess our argument is the progress has to happen at the same rate as the state develops. Otherwise, it overwhelms the state, and that's how we try to talk. We have this chapter at the end, towards the end, which we call Red Queen Out of Control, where we try to think through this sort of populism and the way we talk about that is, this sort of society overwhelms the state. But I'm not sure I really understand this. I'm not sure that social scientists really understand this very much. And I guess that, for a long time, Professor Acemoglu and I, we've worked in these parts of the world where that really doesn't look like the problem in Guatemala or Colombia, or many other parts of the world. So, but I think this model, in some sense, in the book, was our way of sort of trying to think about this, or just try to clarify in our own minds, these interactions, and perhaps you could tell, the book is terribly long, but perhaps we shouldn't have written it because we don't understand it well enough. But it's a sort of framework which at least allows us to talk about these things, which we, in a way that we didn't have before. And what you're raising is many questions that we don't understand the answer to, and the framework only allows us to sort of say ex post. This is back to your cooperation versus co-opting. Oh, that was an example of co-opting, or that was an example of cooperation. How do I know that? Well, things went badly or they went well. But the social science is terrible at predicting things, as you're very well aware. So I think, and I agree with you about, this globalization and discontent, and, I tend to think, you mentioned Marxism. Marx was a sort of technological determinist. He had this idea of, what's this famous phrase, the hand mill gives you feudalism, the steam mill gives you capitalism, or something like that. But that's the opposite of the way Acemoglu and I think. We're, despite the fact that we're both economists, or I describe myself as a recovering economist usually, but I think it's the other way around. I'm a political determinist, not an economic determinist. It's politics that shapes the economy, in some sense, and so we tend to think that the effect of technology is completely mediated, by the political system and how it's regulated or how it's used, or But that being said, if you think about sitting in the United States in the last 4 years, which hasn't been a very pleasant experience, I can tell you. Twitter, for example, where would President Trump be without reality television or Twitter? Like, he didn't have money, he's a useless businessman. He had no kind of connections to, he floated into the whole Republican Party. He'd been a Democrat most of his life, as far as I could tell. But he leveraged this technology that didn't exist, before in a fabulously kind of bedazzling way. I mean, I just don't understand at all, actually, which is a statement, of course, about the divisions and polarization of the United States, that I don't understand, like myself. I don't understand, like, why is this recipe so successful? What is it about Trump that's just so kind of enticing for so many people? If you listen to one of his speeches, he just talks about himself and he brags about, it's like a very weird thing, but it works at some level, some visceral level. And the reason he can reach so many people is because of this technology. So I think that's a counterexample to the way that Acemoglu and I have always thought about this. And so we are, we tend to think of, as I say, we're kind of political determinists, not economic determinists. And so I'm also resisting the narrative of globalization, and, because it wasn't globalization that created the contract with America. If you look at, actually, in the United States, if you look at this sort of divergence, the sort of polarization in the Congress, for example, in terms of, kind of the ability of people to cooperate or jointly sponsor things. And if you look at, political scientists have this way of estimating kind of politicians' ideal points with respect to policy. It's this Newt Gingrich's contract with America that seems to coincide with much. So that's a piece of political innovation and perhaps political entrepreneurship. And perhaps it's exactly an example of, Roshan talking about, a calculated risk. That, Gingrich made a calculated risk, which is, if we're going to become more powerful if we're just going to refuse to disagree. If we could we're just going to refuse to do anything with the Democrats, they'll have to give us what we want, and we're going to become more powerful. And so he did make a calculated gamble, but the downstream consequences of that are this immense kind of polarization in society. I think it's difficult to think that hasn't really interacted with the China, what they call the China shock, what economists here call the China shock, and sort of the social and economic disruption created by the expansion of the Chinese economy. But I do think that there's a sort of there's almost a kind of autonomous political dynamics that have sort of driven this, and to me, like, what was it, what is it what's created, why is inequality diverged so much in this Anglo-Saxon world from Western and Northern Europe, for example? That's everything to do with Mrs. Thatcher. I saw it there. I was out there protesting against it. It was just obvious what the consequences of this were going to be. It took 20, 30 years to kind of really sink in. But to me, that was a political, it was a political and it was a cultural break in society. And I hesitate to use that word cultural, but in many ways it was, speaking as someone who lived through it, there was a big change in people's attitudes about what was acceptable, in terms of behavior. And, think of this whole business of CEO pay rises. It's sort of like norms within businesses sort of crumbled about what was acceptable, and that's led to deunionization. And I think, that's a good point also about, deunionization and these sort of radical, it is a cultural thing. The University of Chicago has been fighting tooth and nail against unionization, for example, of PhD students. And I just ask people, like, what are you so afraid of? Like, what? It's not it's a sort of, it's just trade unions. That like but it's a very odd thing in the United States. This business of. So I think that was a cultural change, and it was a political change. I don't think Mrs. Thatcher was an economic change. It was a kind of reconfig. It led to enormous numbers of economic changes, but it was a sort of reconfiguration of the social contract, if you like, and it was radical, and it had radical consequences, but it's difficult for me to disentangle, if we think now of populism, like what's the consequences of these political changes, or what's the role of the political change relative to some of these economic mechanisms that were triggered by this political change? I guess I'm asking. So I don't know. I'm still trying to disentangle that. And as I said, I've been reading all these books about Trumpism and Trump. There's several very interesting kind of ethnographic books about kind of Republicans in America, and trying to sort of understand I'm trying to understand it because I don't understand it. But maybe that's as I said, perhaps that shows that U.S. society is actually more internally divided than Indian society, because actually maybe there's more things that actually unite India than, from an outsider, it's easy to point at the caste system and read articles about Dalits and things like that, but if you think about the US, maybe high caste people in India actually understand the way Dalit people think, or their problems, or their worldview better than I understand the worldview of somebody in rural Illinois, 50 miles away. So there's very different types of cleavages, like you were pointing out. There's different cleavages in India, between Hindus and Muslim, between the Tamils and Assam, and there's cleavages. They might all speak English here, but that doesn't mean there aren't very powerful cleavages, I think, and different identities. And maybe they're just as strong. I think maybe they're just as strong. I think that one of the things, talking, my own kind of personal intellectual journey, is that one of the things that I've sort of come to recognize, I guess, over the last few years is how much social theory, it's not just economics, how much social theory, I think political science is just as bad almost, how much social theory is sort of driven by, Western history and particular interpretations of Western history, but the rest of the world doesn't look like that, and I think people have different worldviews, different cultures, different religions, different ideas about what's appropriate, and which don't fit into the standard kind of paradigm. So I think that this discussion also of society is our way of trying to kind of think about that. You can't read about the history of China, for instance, without thinking about like Confucianism, or the whole philosophical framework of Confucianism and Confucianism's notion of society and good governance. Like there's a sort of tradition of good governance, which Aristotle rejected, in Western society. If you read Aristotle's Politics, what is that? 2,300 years ago, Aristotle sort of discusses, well, you could run, the society could be run with these ideal political systems with kind of virtuous monarchs or virtuous aristocracies or whatever, but that's never going to happen in reality. It's never going to happen. So we need to find some sort of fix for human frailty, that humans act in their own self-interest and they're not going to act in the collective interest. But in China, you have this endless persistence of this idea that rulers will act in a virtuous way, and it's not appropriate to kind of check them or balance them or have accountability, or it's a completely different, and I think we tend not to take those sort of world views or philosophical views very seriously in social science. We kind of think everyone's always the same, and if when people talk about democratization in China, you mentioned like what Russia mentioned, well, what went wrong with the Soviet Union, or do the Chinese really have a sustainable model? I guess part of the book is about that. Yeah, the Chinese model has been going for 2,300 years, so it's super sustainable, and the idea that somehow, 20 years of economic growth is going to lead to democratization, well, why would we predict that? Well, we have this great idea called modernization theory. Where did modernization theory come from? It came from a particular interpretation of Western economic development. But hello, this is China. And it's a very different type of situation, it seems to me. So the book is also trying to grapple with that idea. That there's this very persistent divergence in the world between different societies. And what is it that's underpinning that, and again, not that we have any kind of theory of that's also like, why did the Chinese or why did the Indians come up with the intellectual, view of the world they have, the religious system and cultural system, and how, and why did the Chinese come, why do Africans think about the state and society the way that Africans think about it? I feel like, so these are, I don't know, you ask so many interesting questions. It's very difficult for me to deal with it all. Yeah.
Yes, and most unfortunately, we've actually run out of time because I had a bunch of questions as well, but we've hit that 1 hour. Thank you so much for joining in. It's really been fascinating even to sit in and just listen to all the points you had to make. I don't know if Mihir and Roshan want to quickly jump in and make a quick comment before we say goodbye to the professor and thank him for his time. Mihir and Roshan.
Go, Roshan, you go first, quickly, if you can.
Well, not much really. I think I completely agree with the spirit of what Professor Robinson is saying. I think, and it is easier to relate to the stuff he's saying sitting in a country like India rather than say somebody in the United States or the Anglo-Saxon part of the world. Thank you so much, Professor, for spending time today with us.
Okay.
Yes, and yes, thank you a lot, and thank you actually for you and Daron for actually sort of making this effort at this book, because I think it's a tremendous task. I'm just going to single out one thing that you happened to, I think, almost in passing say, which was that when you were looking at different parts of the world, you found it difficult to figure out how society, how the social groups were forming and how they were, how cleavages were forming, etc. And it's like economists would, just look at it and say markets work the same way everywhere, right? And so that's fine. And I think that what I would, maybe this is the most deeply unfashionable thing to say, and I'll probably get pilloried for it, but in some sense, economists weren't powerful enough in sociology. And I think the way that you had that brief moment of economism in political science, well, brief when I say it lasted 30 years, I think there is some room for people to start thinking about how you can build models to describe social, to describe different societies, and then try to work out how those models are. If there are systems that work in different ways, sometimes math is the only way to capture in which they work, and sometimes math is the only way then to work out what they have in common. So, so this is going to infuriate pretty much everybody, but especially sociologists who will just now come after me with their black turtlenecks. But I definitely think that there's something there. Not enough math, not enough.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think it's very difficult to see, what's the right abstraction, or where you start. There's so much.
Put a lot of unionized grad students on it, and it'll be sorted out.
I don't know where to start. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mihir and Roshan. And I, just wanted to add as well, Professor Robinson, I know you've said in previous interviews that this is not so much a here and now book. It's a social science agenda that you've built over decades of research. But I think for people joining in and young students who may be listening to this, there is so much of the here and now to absorb from everything in your book. You can literally spot an example with everything that you've raised in your case studies in terms of what we're seeing and living through in different nations. So thank you for this fantastic book. Thank you for your time, most importantly, and for joining us and speaking with us today. And good luck with your book, of course.
It's been my pleasure. Yes, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.